hey, what do you say we finally wrap up December's readings so we can put 2024 officially behind us? Though, with this week, 2025 is going to be a doozy, but we'll have lots of things to read at least. And I recognize this past week on the bookish internet has been pretty rough for a lot of people. And I may circle back and have conversations about TikTok at some point, but I think that there is a lot more nuance to everything than we really ever give it credit. And right now, I'm just sorry for all of the creators who found a home on that platform and built a community on that platform, a community that I was in for many creators. And while I had just started posting within like the last 6 months as I kind of played with short form content has never really yet been my bread and butter or where I artistically go first because, as you were probably aware, I like to babble, but I recognize the impact that TikTok has had on the industry as a whole, for good and bad sometimes. But what is unequivocally good is that it has revitalized and reignited the love of reading for so many people across the board and has helped revitalize especially bookstores. I know in particular with Barnes& Noble, there is a lot of conversation about how, and here I am going off on a tangent, I'm sorry, about how important TikTok has been to Barnes & Noble primarily and the idea of the book talk table and how other platforms like booktube and bookstagram, which have both been forces in their own right over the course of publishing and social media and the social media landscape. For instance, Instagram unequivocally impacted cover design and influenced cover design of books. However, there's a lot of talk about the book talk tables, and there's also a lot of talk about how diverse the book talk tables are, what is represented on the book talk tables, what goes viral on TikTok. All of this is a more nuanced conversation, but it is undeniable that book talk helped push a lot of sales at Barnes& Noble. There are stories that have been coming from booksellers about just how many books were sold because of TikTok and the sheer quantity of books, which was mind-boggling for a lot of seasoned booksellers. And that is very exciting, especially we talk about where Barnes& Noble was in the industry prior. And I played it pretty close to my chest what bookstore I used to work at, but I did used to work at Barnes& Noble, and I was impacted by the mass layoffs in 2018 that many that are very familiar with Barnes& Noble and the history of Barnes& Noble as a business are surely very familiar with. And that was really rough. And so to be in a season where Barnes & Noble is now expanding and where reading has been revitalized, and we'll see, what that looks like. Because, growth and the growth of print sales hasn't been exponential, but it has still been significant. And so I will be very interested to see how that develops. And just from someone who has been a lifelong reader and loves talking and engaging about books and stories, it's exciting to see people talk and engage with books and stories. And I hope that those who found community on TikTok, while also grieving that, because whether it comes back or not, I think we have to acknowledge after the message that was left when the app went down that there are some considerations there. I don't know what it's going to be. I don't know anything. I'm just here to talk about books. But yeah, I just want to acknowledge those who may be feeling a little adrift while also acknowledging the other vibrant communities and the other different ways of discussing books. I mean, if we think back to the books that first went viral on TikTok and that first kind of wave of what we considered book talk books, those were all bestsellers before, and we really have the opportunity to continue to push the stories that we are interested in hearing. And it is more important than ever to continue to engage with these stories. And with that, I will get off my soapbox. Again, those thoughts are kind of off the cuff. They are not refined in any way. There are a lot of pockets of that conversation that could be had. For instance, I mean, even going back to the kind of influence at Barnes & Noble and these book talk tables, like that coincides also with Barnes & Noble having been sold out of corporate ownership to James Daunt, who allowed for more personalization and individuality in the stores and the merchandising in stores than I personally saw as a bookseller. So yeah, I don't know. We'll come back to that maybe if people are interested, or maybe we will have a live at some point where we just kind of ponder together. I don't know. What I do know is we need to focus on talking about these books because I'm trying to do a 24-hour reading challenge over 3 days. So like on easy mode, but still I have to get this filmed. I have to get this edited. I have other things to do. And we'll see. I mean, I might fail. You may never actually see a video about a 24-hour reading challenge, but we'll see. I really just want to read this weekend. So as you may know, if you watched my best books, a couple worst books of 2024 video, I read 105 books over the course of 2024, which, as I said then, and will say again now, is my worst reading year on record on Goodreads. And that just is what it is. I don't know. I felt very disconnected during the middle of the year, especially in my reading, and I don't know that I can pinpoint it exactly. There was Bridgerton, there was starting a new job, there was a lot going on. Who knows? But I'm hopeful that we can kind of swing back into things this year because there are a lot of stories I want to read and engage with. But I did do at the end of 2024, in December, over the holidays, I really focused on getting my currently reading cleared out in Goodreads because I was reading like 4 things, which, you know, isn't the most someone has ever had and they're currently reading by any means, but like I had a book that I started during vacation in Japan. Remember when I went to Japan and never talked about that? It may be too late now. Maybe someday I'll pop on a short with the books I picked up in Japan. Who knows? But I started a book then, I had some other books going, and so I needed to just clear them out. So let's go ahead and talk about the books after that very prolonged intro. But hi, my name is Melody. If you have never been here before, if I've just been babbling so long you've forgotten who I am in this moment. But we talk about books and book adjacent things on this channel, and if that's of interest to you, I would love for you to hang out more, as well as like, subscribe, comment your thoughts as you are so inspired. But also, before we jump into the books completely, I am looking at this through the Goodreads challenge just because I failed at keeping my spreadsheet updated last year, I realized, but I rebought a 2025 tracking reading spreadsheet and I will be more diligent this year. But another kind of sign of how disconnected I was because I just realized I abandoned it mid-year. Anyway, but I hate the new layout of the reading challenge. And I'm saying this as someone, again, who's been on Goodreads since 2007 and just had to mentally get over the fact that the reading challenges are not new. This is not new. So I hate it. I think there's just too many clicks needed now. Am I sad to lose the ability to creep on my friends' challenges easily? Yes. But I also stayed away from the social media functionalities of the app for a long time. So maybe that's not as noticeable for me. I don't know. I'm annoyed by it, but I'm more annoyed by the number of clicks. Like if I click on a book in my challenge, I shouldn't have to click to be like, yes, I want to go look at the book that I just clicked on. Anyway, the first book I read was The Lady He Lost by Faye Delacour, which we talked about during a Feature Friday. I read this on my Kobo and I would hold it up for you now, except I took it out reading on errands last weekend and it got too cold and then I couldn't turn it back on. And then when I was trying to turn it back on, instead of turning it back on, I accidentally reset it, which means I had to re-download all my books, and I just didn't re-download the ones that I had already read. So that is that. I'm really doing well with the tangents, right? So this was a debut historical romance that came out in 2024, and it was a fun surprise. I picked it up primarily because there was this angle of our female lead, Jane, trying or wanting to start a female, like, gambling hell or gaming hell, and our male lead, Eli, was coming back from being presumed dead, and he had to get back into the good graces of Jane, who was a childhood friend, and Jane had a crush on Eli. This book is ripe to be retold as gossip, as I said in my Feature Friday. Jane had a crush on Eli. Eli is caught in a compromising position with Jane's cousin, a cousin that there is a somewhat rivalry between the two of them. Eli goes off with the Navy after being caught in this position. There is an engagement arranged, and then he goes off and he dies at sea, presumably, because the ship goes through things he's never found. He comes back, as the beginning of the book says, he's not even wet. There is a lot of surprise humor in this book because I thought it was going to be really angst driven. And there is some angst. It honestly could have been amped up a little bit, especially from Eli, who is kind of oblivious. He's been kind of avoiding things because, fun fact, surprise, surprise, he didn't actually want to marry Jane's cousin, but he also thinks he can just kind of waltz back in and things will go back to normal with Jane. So, he doesn't really understand things super well, but he does try and help get back into her good graces with this gaming hell endeavor she is partaking in because he is a big draw because his story is so interesting. And with that story, Jane has some questions. She's like, what exactly went on? Unfortunately, some of her questions lead to some complications for him and what the Navy thinks about what is going on and whether some suspicions arise from his time away and what repercussions that has for him and his career and livelihood. And so there are high stakes there, even amidst the humor. Additionally, one thing I really enjoyed was the kind of experience level of these characters. We have a hero who is enthusiastic but as inexperienced as our heroine. And so it's kind of charming to watch them discover things together. And I really enjoyed them. Again, the end and some of the angsty bits I think could have been amped up, and just the weight of some of the choices that were made, the weight of that could have been felt a little bit more. But overall, I really enjoyed this. I was pleasantly surprised by how much I enjoyed this. I thought it was a real breath of fresh air, and I'm very much enjoying, or looking forward, I should say, to the next one, as well as already anticipating or really wanting and hoping that we get the story for Eli's sister. So yeah, a really good time. And then I read The House at Watch Hill by Karen Marie Moning, which we also did a Feature Friday on. Now, Karen Marie Moning was very popular in the 2000s in the paranormal romance, kind of urban fantasy realm, most well known for her Fever series. I discovered her with her Highlander time travel romances, which have some of the kind of darkness and grit of the Fever series, but just the kind of genesis and origins of it. And so this is a new series, kind of billed as a gothic haunted house. And again, like the first series that we've gotten from her since the Fever series. Now, I will admit, and I admitted in my last video or my Feature Friday as well, I have not officially finished the Fever series, which I was obsessed with as a teenager, eagerly anticipating books, having books pre-ordered on my Kindle at college to drop at midnight. But after Iced, she clearly wrote herself into a corner, and I read a couple of books past Iced, and then something happened, and I don't even remember the last one I read at this point. I think I have two to actually officially finish the extension of the series, but there was a decision in bringing Mac back and a decision within Mac's world that really made me angry because it kind of undercut the entirety of Mac's journey in the original 5-book arc. Anyway, thinking and reading this book has me thinking about those books a little differently in the sense of what was the world building and would it stand up for me as much today as I enjoyed it, even knowing it was kind of leaning toward camp at the time in some ways. Would I enjoy it the same? Because I was frustrated with this one, I'm not gonna lie. I love gothics and haunted, kind of sinister houses, as we know. And haunted for me, I use kind of loosely, right? Because I don't read things that I would consider traditional horror, but have been kind of lumped into horror in the kind of grand schema, but just atmospheric. And so I was very excited for this. Additionally, again, new series. While the Fever series stands on its own, it does bring in the McKelters, who show up in the Highland romances. So there are ties between the two series, and I was interested to see if there will be any ties in this series. I won't illuminate what I feel the answer to that is, but it was a part of the question for me. And this is the first series from her taking place in the US as well. Though we do have, I think it is the Scottish influence in the fact that this isolated town that she ends up in is essentially the Scottish town that has come over and insulated itself in whatever ways with whatever supernatural means may come into play there. Now, the book does start in Indiana, which was wild for me, especially because when I was a teenager reading her books, I really clung to that Indiana connection as a young Hoosier that never really appeared beyond her author's note. And then here we have references to, like, there's a reference to a Purdue student, and I grew up in the Purdue ecosystem. And so, yeah, that was an interesting touch. Now, with that, I think the pacing of this was all over the place. I think we had a protagonist in Roe who was trying to not be Mac very, very hard, but also still ended up feeling like Mac in many ways, or felt like the kind of brand of female empowerment that Mac existed in, or felt very much of the mid 2000s, which was interesting because this type of paranormal fantasy romance has really come back into the zeitgeist in a really exciting way. So this is primed to reach a readership now, absolutely, but it felt very dated in a lot of ways, even as I felt her trying to distinguish Ro from Mac in a lot of ways. But yeah, I just didn't feel the tension of the house, and part of that comes down to the first person narrative, mostly from Ro's point of view, but occasionally from other characters, sometimes undercut the tension by referencing or alluding to things that were coming up, or having like little asides along the lines of, I wouldn't know how important this moment was until kind of stuff. And it just didn't feel like it allowed me as a reader to live in the moment, as well as it fell back on some narrative crutches that again didn't feel like it distinguishes it enough from the Fever series, in that there is another sentient book. And, you know, a sentient book is interesting. We're not chasing all over Dublin for it this time. However, it does do a lot of info dumping, which is worse, I think, because it just gives us all this information that we could have discovered organically. And instead, we kind of set up some potential love interests for Ro, but the romance really isn't the center of things. And I never feel the kind of organic heat of those attractions beyond being told that Ro is attracted to these people, including a one-night stand at the beginning of the book that like follows her throughout the rest of the book. We don't see it in detail, which whatever, but it is apparently the steamiest thing ever, and we are reminded of that pretty frequently for a man that appears for a blip at the beginning of the book. So obviously I knew he was going to come back. I didn't know in what way. I still kind of don't, but it felt kind of forced in that, going back again to that idea of the kind of mid 2000s ideas of sensuality and empowerment and what those are and how those function in this book. I don't know. I wasn't expecting it to be revelatory, but I was expecting to have a good time. And she's a very nostalgic author for me. Again, perfectly primed in the current moment to come out with something new. And also I bought the book, so I had a vested interest in enjoying it. But it felt a lot lackluster to me. I will probably be reading the sequel because there was a twist at the end that I just want to see how she develops or where it goes if we get better, because it did feel like a lot of exposition in this book. There was a lot of time spent on backstory in a way that felt like we needed that to come with her in a significant way. I didn't really feel a shift or development from her as a character in this book, which leads me to believe we're going to have the larger character arc over the series, which I support, but I also kind of need the microcosm, right? We need something happening within this book as well. And we did get something. She kind of lived in anger for a lot of the book, but an anger that didn't feel like it allowed for a lot of nuance. But yeah, not my favorite. Okay, to return to TikTok for a brief moment, I read How to Piss Off Men by Kyle Prue, who was one of the first creators I discovered on the app, and I was clearly drawn to his theater kid energy, Angels in America references and all. And so I was intrigued by what the book form of his popular TikTok series would be, and it was reminiscent, or is reminiscent, of kind of like the YouTuber book era, in the sense that this book is more a vehicle for the people who maybe weren't on the app, or super fans who still want access to the content, or us now who do not have access to the content. But it's a good reminder that the kind of jokes we now are primed to get in short form content from TikTok, we used to pay $17 for in a floppy paperback, which is great for if you have time to kill at the doctor's office, you just have an afternoon, a couple hours that you need something to do and you want a little chuckle. This is perfect. Actually, let me go ahead and just read you my review that I wrote. I said, have an hour to kill in a waiting room or on the train. This was a great reminder. We used to pay $17, though to be fair, probably closer to 10 to 15, for the punchy witticisms that we get for free and land better on TikTok. However, facing the cusp of not having the app anymore, it's a nice reminder this kind of content isn't going anywhere. As long as internet platforms have risen to popularity, we've been translating the greatest hits of certain creators to book form so that maybe someone who isn't chronically online will be amused. I say this as the highest compliment, but I would read this behind the cash wrap, and I used to read Marie Kondo and James Patterson bookshots back there. Remember bookshots? I don't know that we need to. There is an attempt to add some more profound ponderings, and while I appreciate the effort, I don't know that they're fully developed. So mostly these are just the written form of the TikTok punchlines, but we do have an intro. Well, we have a how to use this book, a disclaimer, and then at the end we have a little mini essay which attempts to kind of add some context. And there is self-awareness in this book in terms of the safety he may have in throwing some of these quips that others may not, but I've always felt that. I really enjoyed this TikTok series. I'm going to miss it if we don't get any more, and I think it's very much a product of its time as well. So I think it is worth picking up at the library and just paging through if you're interested. It's good for an offhand chuckle, but I do think it lands better if you know Prue's delivery style, and honestly, I do think it lands better on TikTok. I think there's a lot to be said about his delivery of the jokes, and there are layers of the jokes that don't translate to the book. For instance, he doesn't try and sneak in the polyamory hashtag anywhere. Okay, next we begin my stretch of TBR cleanout books, which makes sense because I read 8 books in December. I don't think I mentioned that. I read 8 books in December, and 4 of them would have been from my currently reading when I started that project. So here we go. The first was Throne of the Fallen by Carrie Maniscalco, which I read on Kindle Unlimited, and it is the first in a romantasy series with the 7 deadly sins as princes of some underworld or paranormal, supernatural, individual realms. Honestly, very similar to Fae Courts with the potential for more courts, and also there are still Fae Courts. So prior to this, I had only read the Stalking Jack the Ripper series, which I believe was her debut. Also, out of James Patterson Presents, to bring Patterson back into it for absolutely no reason, which I really don't want to do. Anyway, I really enjoyed those books. So I was interested to see what she would do with the romantasy genre and how I would respond, because romantasy can be kind of hit or miss for me. And I think that there were moments of hit and moments of miss both for me in this book. I really enjoyed it. And at times I also didn't know where we were going, what we were building to. The world was very large and not all of it was really fully drawn, but at the same time, I think it was pulling on things familiar enough that we could go with it. So in this book, we're following Envy, who is on a hunt or a part of a game, essentially, to help rescue his court, but he doesn't know who the other players are. But this game causes him to seek out Camilla, our female love interest, who is in the human realm. And so he goes to the human realm, which still knows of like supernatural and paranormal things, or at least our characters do, but feels more like a historical romance coded kind of world. And so we start out within those constraints, switching between points of view, but we don't go into the real supernatural realms until I want to say like midpoint through the book. It was hard to kind of feel the pacing because I was reading it digitally, but we do spend time in that world and those conventions as he is attempting to convince her to paint this picture that she doesn't want to paint because it is a relic that she doesn't want to touch. And so we do have these conventions of being caught in compromising positions and that leading to engagements and this and that and the other. Then she is drawn into this game with him when her powers, her artistic powers, which may be more than they first appear, are stolen and she wants to get them back. And so he has been hiding his identity from her. She keeps secrets regarding her being pulled into the game eventually from him. And so there are a lot of pieces at play. And part of the allure is this kind of shifting allegiances. While they are kind of playing this cat and mouse game to a certain extent, they are on the same side for now because their goals align in the same direction. But will that be forever? Additionally, Envy has this rule that he will only ever sleep with someone for one night. And there is this very distinct growing attraction between these two. And so there is a push-pull kind of power play over this physical attraction as well as emotions are clearly maybe developing a little further because this is a romantasy. And so there is just a lot going on. And at times I felt it wasn't perfectly paced, but I also did have a good time. And it was interesting to see, I was very intrigued by how we were going to play in to the idea of these sins and the power of these sins. And I will continue to be interested as we go to other brothers, as well as certain sins may be considered, more attractive than others. I wouldn't have, prior to this book, considered envy a particularly attractive sin in the terms of mining it for a romance in whatever way. So that was interesting. The rules of the world feel a little bit kind of taken on faith. If you've read a lot of these kinds of books, I think that it's an easy kind of suspension of disbelief. We have like the night markets and powers and the fae, and now we have these additional courts. While there were times I did think it was a little bloated and it lagged at certain points, I do think some of those points or parts were setting up future things in the series. I think the conventions and what readers in this genre expect the story to be a little bit more bloated in whatever way. And I'm not saying that with a judgmental tone in this case, but if we think about it in context or contrasted to like the paranormal supernatural romance of the 2000s, that felt a little bit more concise and punchy than now. Now we kind of want to play around and move around in the world a little bit more. Whether that's always successful or not, I don't know, but I understand the want, and that is part of the appeal. I will say, having it a little bit more drawn out, I did appreciate in the context of the romance, because it felt like we got to develop that a little bit more. They were spending time together. We got to have a lot of reversals within that relationship. They were questioning things within each other and within themselves. And so there was more weight there and it felt more earned. So that I did appreciate, even if I did have to suspend some of my disbelief about the world around them at certain points. I'm willing to do that. And there were some unquestionably seamy bits in this. So I first put it on hold at the library, but I didn't get to pick up my hold in time, so it expired off. But then it went on sale on Kobo for $5. So I decided I could spend $5 on the second one, which I have read some mixed reviews about. So if you've read the second one already, let me know what your thoughts are. But I do own it, so I probably should read it at some point. But that could be said of a lot of books. So I don't know. If you've read again the second one, let me know. But I did enjoy the first one, and I enjoyed seeing some of the setup at the end of the first one to kind of prime us and push us into some of the other brothers' journeys, and I'll be interested to see where those go. That was the start of my currently reading Clear Out, but we have now talked about 4 books. So the next book I read and was part of my currently reading Clear Out was Strange Weather in Tokyo by Hiromi Kawakami, and I, unsurprisingly, started this in Tokyo. Now, I did not finish it, even though it is a very short book, because on the flight home I got distracted by needing to read a Diana Quincy romance, which I think is valid. But also I went into this expecting a romance, which it is on some levels, but not like a genre romance. There is a lot of loneliness and sadness still in this book, and a lot of the Japanese literature I had been reading over the course of the week, even the cozier ones, though granted I didn't read, tons and tons because I was also on vacation, but had been steeped in a kind of loneliness and isolation in whatever way, and so I just needed a small break from it. And so I circled back, and this is following a woman who reunites with a former professor, not a former professor, a former teacher in an izakaya when she is in her 30s and he is much older. And so there is a significant age gap, and it follows them developing a relationship of whatever sort and the kind of then progress and how that relationship grows and changes. And he has been through a divorce, and his ex-wife passed away, and she is single and has been single for a long time, or just like dated casually. And so there is a sense within the tone of this isolation and just the sense of them kind of meeting together frequently at the izakaya and drinking together, and excuse my pronunciations. And there was a moment in the book where I did worry about both of the characters' relationships with alcohol, and that, feeds into those feelings of loneliness, or fed into those feelings of loneliness. And part of it is the writing style as well, I think. In my experience so far with Japanese literature, which is still more limited recently, I feel like the language errs more on the side of Hemingway in terms of directness, while still also managing to imbue a lot of feeling within the sentences that I don't necessarily associate with Hemingway directly. There's still these feelings, or are still these feelings, but at the same time, there also, for me as a reader, feels like there's a kind of distance from the narrative as well that furthers these feelings of loneliness and isolation that some of these narratives I have been reading are exploring, and it makes it kind of steeped in sadness in some ways. And these are very valid emotions to be exploring, but it can also be hard in extended jaunts. And this book just got a little sad for me at a certain point where I just needed a little bit of a break from it. And it is also, of course, a really unconventional romance in a lot of ways, which is part of what drew me to it, because it was showing something so different and looking at this connection between these two people that are so different and from different generations and what draws them together. And I can absolutely understand and appreciate those feelings of isolation and loneliness in a city as big and as busy as Tokyo. But I don't know. It was very interesting. I don't know that I have complete insights into this one. I think that there's a lot to unpack here, and it's a very quiet novel. It spans a lot of time, but it shoots right to the point in a lot of it. It is blunt in some places, and it is a little bit more opaque in others. And it's really beautiful, and at times I also found it incredibly sad. And so I'm glad to have read it, but yeah. And then kind of switching tonally to a complete opposite in some ways, I read An Education in Pleasure by Eva Leigh, which is a novella available on Kindle Unlimited. And it also involves an age gap, this time with a governess who has a relationship or a flirtation or what have you with the new lord who has inherited and come home. And she has been a longtime governess of his younger sisters who was hired on around the time that he went off to school. And come to find out, he has always had a giant crush on her. And so he is dealing with kind of inheriting this position, dealing with the grief of losing his father, the weight of responsibility that he is facing, and how his father has instructed him to take those responsibilities seriously, take the care of the people under him seriously, and how that impacts his relationship with this governess. It's kind of like if Anthony Bridgerton had had someone right there that he'd had a crush on after his dad died in some ways. But as steamy as this was, what I most appreciated was that kind of engaging with the weight of responsibility of what he could do as the lord of this house and the power he had over this governess, and what that power dynamic looked like in their relationship, but acknowledging that, him taking ownership of that and attempting to mitigate that, and kind of battling with that inner conflict of whether he was abusing his power in this way and having that open dialogue. I thought that was really stellar while still having some steamy scenes. Again, I don't know. I'm going to keep reading the novellas because they're nice little quick hits of authors I love. But I do think that I really would have loved to see this expanded. At the same time, these circumstances here are very contained, and I don't know how long we could have sustained the tension of the circumstances with these characters. So maybe it wouldn't have worked as well in a longer novel. And while I was initially a little hesitant about how this would play out, I enjoyed it. Next, a book I've talked about a couple of times already, so I won't keep you too long on it, but we have Amari and the Despicable Wonders by B.B. Alston, which is the third in the Supernatural Investigations series that starts with Amari and the Night Brothers. And I, as you well know, love Amari. This book was interesting because it was pushing outside of the world that we have known so far inside this universe, and that is always a little dicey because sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And on top of that, we have the kind of wrap up of a 3-book arc that is being expanded into a 5-book arc. So there was a lot going on there. And while the pacing wasn't always perfect for me in this, I love these characters and this world so much. I was just happy to be along for the ride. I do think that the way that we engaged with the larger supernatural world in this book was really delightful. I think we had some like home bases that helped ground us while we got to expand out. And I think that the jokes and literary references and callbacks and jokes in this were still just so much fun. It continues to be full of this kind of joy and wonder, even amidst these really big stakes and harder circumstances and conversations. It continues to push really excellent ideas of friendship and considerations, and these characters are ultimately, the friends in this are ultimately so good to each other, sometimes to a fault in the sense that they make mistakes, but they're always so aware, I feel like, sometimes of where the mistakes are. And I'm not saying I want them to mess up more or be messier. Honestly, probably Dylan is messy enough for all of them, but I do feel like sometimes there's less leeway for that. But I feel like these characters understand there's less leeway for them to make mistakes. And Amari, especially as a magician, and the weight of that feels like the world is on her shoulders for a lot of reasons, and also she has such a firm moral compass. And so she does make mistakes. She does act rashly sometimes, but she's always so assured in those decisions. And sometimes, they are the right decisions. And part of that is that kind of confirmation bias of seeing her make the right decision, even if it isn't necessarily known by others in the world to be the right decision. And sometimes she doesn't make the right decision. And we see some fallout of some hard decisions being made at the end of the book in the way that was a lot, but also gave a price and consequences to the action of the book, because the stakes are high and we can't come out, unfortunately, completely unscathed, especially if there are two more books. And so I'm very, very interested to see where the arc of this is going to continue to develop. I'm interested to see where Amari and Quentin's relationship as brother and sister go, as it was kind of dicey here. And, we had Quentin coming back into the picture as this renowned hero, very sure of himself and his skills, who doesn't really know how Amari has developed over the last few years. Amari is still very much a child to him, and honestly is still very much a child. And so he maybe wasn't taking her knowledge and considerations with as much weight as he should have. But yeah, the stakes were high, but we still managed to find opportunities for the wonder and joy throughout. And while I would have loved for some more opportunities, especially Jaden as a character felt like he was kind of sidelined this book, I would have loved some more from him, but he still did get a ghost friend, so that was nice. So yes, still cannot recommend this series highly enough, and I'm very excited to see where we continue to go with it. Again, if you want to hear me talk about it more in depth, I do have a feature Friday on this book, as well as the previous two. And then finally, my last book of the year, which I did between audio and digital, was Don't Want You Like a Best Friend by Emma R. Albin, which came out last year. It came out January of last year. For some reason, I thought it came out in 2023 because the follow-up in this series came out last fall. So we're moving quickly. And I'm not gonna lie to you, I almost didn't read this book because I don't know how I feel about the Taylor Swift lyrics in the title, especially this particular title, because the follow-up book also has Taylor Swift lyrics, but this is a lesbian historical romance, and it has the title Don't Want You Like a Best Friend, which is, very clever, but within the context of the Taylor Swift fandom becomes a lot more convoluted. Anyway, here we have our two romantic interests, Beth, who is on her first season out after the death of her father, and there are a lot of stakes in that she needs to make a good marriage, and her mother is very intent on her making a good marriage. And then we have more unconventional Gwen, who has been out for 4-ish seasons and is given a lot of leeway by her widowed, rakish father. And they meet at a ball early in the season, and Beth is excited to have made a new friend. Gwen is excited to have met someone new, especially a new friend, amidst the kind of monotony of the season. And they find themselves drawn to each other event after event, especially as the pickings for Beth feel kind of dull and lackluster, and her season is off to a very slow start in terms of suitors, much to her mother's annoyance or like fear. And because of this, Gwen and Beth have really been drawn to each other at all of these events, and her mother feels like Beth is ignoring her duties in trying to find a husband, and so has encouraged her not to hang out with Gwen. Meanwhile, Beth and Gwen have noticed some tension between their parents when they come across each other. And so in an effort to attempt to get to hang out more and to remove some of this pressure from Beth, they uncover some hidden romantic interest potentially between their parents and try to parent trap them in order to give Beth some more breathing room in her season to find a match that actually appeals to her. Meanwhile, over the course of this, Beth and Gwen develop or recognize their feelings as developing in a way that is beyond friendship. And thus the stakes of getting their parents together become even higher, even as Beth has accidentally stumbled in to a real match that her mother is really pushing, even as the family of this man, who is not bad on his own, but his father is atrocious, because there's also this side plot or secondary plot regarding politics and a particular bill that would allow for divorce, which Gwen's father is really pushing. And this bill also would have benefited Beth's mother, who was in a very messy marriage when her father was alive, and abusive, to be frankly honest. But Beth's new suitor's father is firmly against this bill, to the point of wanting to forbid Beth and Gwen from even interacting. And so things get really convoluted, and there are all of these secondary kind of considerations. So we have the main romance between Beth and Gwen and this really delightful friends to lovers plot line, because we get to see the friendship develop, and then we get to see it develop past that and them recognize those feelings go beyond friendship. And then we have the secondary romance between their parents, combined with this really high stakes political consideration and a lot of the kind of backroom dealings and pressures that go along with that. And so there is that weight of the reality of what this marriage is going to mean, what this marriage meant for Beth's mother, and what it will mean for her to enter a marriage like that. And so we have these high stakes while also recognizing the reality of the situation. But the secondary romance gives Gwen and Beth some breathing room, potentially, in that, and being able to kind of build their own futures. Now, I will say, I really loved the secondary romance in this, to the extent that sometimes I felt it overshadowed the primary romance, because the tension there was just really delicious. There were moments of tension in Beth and Gwen's relationship that I thought worked really well, especially when they were just kind of realizing their feelings, which was hard enough on its own, and at the same time there were all of these outside factors that were impeding things. And I think that that could have even been ramped up, but there was something that was almost scene stealing about their parents and the history that was built in there, because we learn there is a history. And I don't know if it's that I'm just drawn to things that aren't quite as sweet, but I still loved Beth and Gwen. I just felt like sometimes they were overshadowed in their own romance. Still, there were some really beautiful moments here. There was a lot of attraction and heat. Their first kiss, I will not spoil, obviously, but loved it. Loved their first kiss. So really enjoyed this. Glad I got over my hurdle of the title, because it was really delightful. And again, another excellent debut from a new historical romance author in 2024. So I know I read in 2024 at least 3 historical romance debuts, and I'm always happy when we're still getting those, since the market, as we've discussed, is a little dicey right now. So enjoyed it. So overall, I had a really kind of average but very enjoyable December, and honestly, average is something to celebrate for me, or for me right now in my reading life. I want to get back to my average, and I think I'm on the right track for January so far, so knock on wood. But yeah, that's what I read in December. And if you've read any of these, as always, I would love to hear your thoughts. Please leave those below. But thank you again, as always, for hanging out and listening to mine, as well as that partial TikTok tangent at the beginning. But like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good, and yeah, bye.